In relation to personal liability of elected members, if for any reason you are named as a party to legal action, you are generally indemnified by council for costs and damages and any civil liability if you acted in good faith and in pursuance of council's responsibilities or powers, and the costs of successful defence of criminal action relating to acts or omissions as a member. There are provisions in that legislation for certain circumstances where you may be personally liable for any unlawful loss of council. There are certain defences available, and there is a very high threshold trigger for that liability arising, and that members are only liable if the Auditor General issues a report on the unlawful loss to the Minister of Local Government. In relation to the Local Government Official Information and Meeting Act, there are two important aspects of that. First of all, it governs how meetings such as the meeting that we're in today are conducted, and also how council is to respond to requests for information it holds. In relation to the provisions for how council meetings are conducted, the standing orders form an important part of that procedural requirement, and members are required to comply with standing orders. There is, of course, an very important presumption in that Act that council decision meetings will be open to the public, and that is to enable effective public participation in council decisions and council's accountability. But there are opportunities for when good decision making requires the public to be excluded for that to occur. That is a matter which is voted on a case-by-case basis by elected members. The transparency and openness principles that underpin the official information component of that is that, consistent with the principle of open and transparent democracy, information is to be made available unless there is good reason for withholding it. I mentioned the Health and Safety at Work Act, and there has been an extensive education program for previous existing members in relation to this, and that education program will continue. The important point, and it's the obligations of due diligence are explained in detail in the information on the agenda. The important point for you today is that council as the entity has an obligation to ensure the safety of its staff, visitors and others. The role of elected members is to exercise a duty of due diligence. There are 6 specific aspects to that duty to ensure that council is fulfilling that obligation. In relation to the Local Authorities Members' Interests Act, this deals with financial conflicts of interest in certain circumstances that prohibits elected members from taking part in discussions or voting on situations where an elected member has a direct or an indirect financial interest other than an interest that is in common with the general public. And the members that have been participated in the assessment of positions in advance of the unitary plan decision making will be aware of the detailed analysis that's required to ascertain whether that interest is triggered in any particular circumstance. It also prohibits elected members from entering into contracts with the council that are valued over $25,000. And an important point to be aware of there is that these rules can apply where a spouse, partner, company, or possibly family trust has a financial interest or is concerned in any relevant contract. There are important other rules outside of this statute that concern financial and non-financial conflicts of interest in public decision making, and those are reflected, of course, in our standing orders and in our code of conduct. In relation to the Crimes Act 1961, this includes crimes of bribery and corruption by elected members and employees of local authorities. Plainly, it's an offence for an elected member to corruptly accept or obtain a bribe for doing or not doing something in his or her official capacity as an elected member. It is also an offence for an elected member to corruptly use or disclose any information received in that role to obtain any advantage or financial gain. A consequence of conviction may be imprisonment and would result in an elected member being disqualified from office. The Secret Commissions Act 1910 makes it an offence for an elected member to take bribes or use their position for improper gain. It is also an offence for an elected member not to disclose a direct or indirect financial interest he or she or a close family member has in a council contract. The consequences are the same as for the Crimes Act. The Financial Markets Conduct Act applies to council because, as you know, that we issue bonds to the public on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. Elected members may be an information insider in terms of this act. Therefore, there are circumstances where elected members will receive material information that is not generally available to the market, and there are limitations on what you can do in those circumstances. Certainly you must not trade in council bonds or disclose information that another person who is likely to trade in council bonds or to encourage any person to do so. What's material information is information that a reasonable person would expect, if it was generally available to the market, to have a material effect on the price of quoted financial products of Auckland Council. You have also specific responsibilities, just like company directors, when investment offers are made to the public, and in those circumstances many of you around the table will be familiar with the advice that goes out at that time to refrain from any public comments at such times. Again, there are potential civil penalties, criminal convictions and potential disqualification from office for breach of those requirements. That was all I was intending to go through in terms of a brief overview, but I do encourage you to keep the paper that's attached to this agenda as a ready resource and not to hesitate at all to come to me or my team for any specific advice you may require.
Thank you very much, Catherine Anderson. Are there any questions of the Director relating to the information you've just received? I think it's reasonably clear, but also very important that we acknowledge those rules and regulations which are binding on us. Can I move that the governing body note the general explanation of the laws affecting elected members? Have I got a seconder? Seconded by Bill Cashmore. John. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. We now come, thank you very much, Catherine and Danny. We come to item number 15 on the agenda, which is the establishment of committees and the appointment of chairpersons. Back in October, on the 20th, I announced my decisions in regard to the committees that have been set up and the appointment of chairpersons. I think the significant, and there are significant changes that have been made here, changes that are designed to improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of how we operate. And the net effect of those changes is to reduce the number of committees from 19 down to 9. That is quite a major restructuring. And the purpose of that, excuse me, is to streamline our decision making. The consequences of those decisions are that we'll have 5 fewer meetings a month, up to 15 fewer reports needing to be prepared, and an estimated 25% saving in councillor and official time. I'm conscious and mentioned by some giving their maiden speeches that people have called on this council to be more effective and efficient, to do more with less, and to find savings where they can be made without diminishing the quality of our decision making or the services that are provided. And that's what this restructuring is intended to do. As with any restructuring, you don't always get it 100% right the first time. And I've also announced that a year hence we will be examining how that has worked, whether further changes need to be made, and also examining the performance of those who have chaired the committees, have been appointed as chairs of the committee. I think that the changes are significant. They're not made in a vacuum. I've listened to what each of you have said to me when I've asked you about this. I've listened to the reports that we have received from officials, and I think that this will be a significant step forward. But now is the time if you have any issues that you wish to discuss or questions you'd like to ask on this noting recommendation. Yeah, please, Councillor Hulse.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to raise an issue, and I'm not going to move an amendment or move any recommendations in connection with this, but it's something I've given a lot of thought to, and looking at the relationship between the Planning Committee and the Environment and Community Committee, and particularly in light of some of the comments made in the maiden speeches, housing is the most critical issue that this council is facing, and it's certainly one that you've identified correctly and have championed to deal to. The issue that I want to raise is the supply side quite correctly sits within the planning committee, so that's all the work that's been done, you know, driving growth issues, infrastructure issues and planning issues forward. However, the other side of that is the impact on community, the relationships, the partnerships with community, the impacts on the real people who are going to live in these houses and the communities into which we are imposing future growth. So what I'd like to propose, and in discussion with the Deputy Mayor and Councillor Darby and our Deputy Chairs, Councillor Filipaina and Councillor Lee, I think we need to just have a discussion whether it's a change to the actual delegations or simply an agreement through the work programs that within the Community and Environment Committee, which then works in partnership with Councillor Casey, that we have the ability to deal with the community aspects of housing. I think these have been dealt to reasonably effectively, but I think we now need to put the full force of what's available through this committee into that issue to complement the work being done by the Planning Committee. So I won't move a recommendation in that direction, but I would just like to signal that I think that work needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hulse. Is there any other comment on that before I make a broad comment?
Not on.
Yeah, Councillor Darby.
Thank you, Mayor. And while this is more relating to the terms of reference, which is item 16, I'm happy to consider it here. And I think there is a place for us to, not just the chairs and deputy chairs of the major committees, but also the councillors to have input. And most importantly is your office as well, Mr. Mayor. You've outlined a structure here, and I think it's a good structure. It's a long overdue, well-refined structure, and thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm happy for us to look at maybe some overlaps and some refinements. But I think it's important that we finalise that and get that back on the table pre-Christmas at our ultimate GB meeting, governing body meeting prior to the recess, so that we can give some certainty going forward. But happy to do that, do it liaising with the chairs, the Deputy Mayor, and most importantly, all the elected members and your office.
Thank you, Councillor Darby. Can I recognise Councillor Filipaina?
Not on this particular issue, Your Worship. I've got a comment and question, however.
Oh, okay. Should I hold
so
that?
I will wait
I'll hold
for your
that over
comment,
until we've dealt
yep,
with this
and then
issue.
I'll
Thank
speak
you. Councillor Cashmore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. With this new committee structure, there are going to be obviously numerous overlaps with the three committees of the whole. And as we work through the management programs and work programs for the next 3 years, there will be have to be some iterative work done to actually say where Pacific pieces lie. And you think of things like Tamaki Redevelopment Company. You think about housing for elderly. You think about some of the youth challenges that we have from employment. They have crossovers with economy, community and planning. What we need to do is work through that detail over the next month or so to come up with those work plans and then come back to the governing body and say this is what we're potentially looking at, and get all of us here to sign off on iterative pieces of 3 years' work, which is important that we get the buy-in of all. The second point, Mr. Mayor, is to do with the advisory panels. And the question to you, sir, is you have the sign-off on the membership of those panels. When are you proposing that we go through those lists to procure those names, those numbers, and to get your recognition and official stamp